Hey, this is the World Advice Channel 2. What I want to talk about today is the question of what would have happened if the transatlantic slave trade never happened. So, for this video, I will explain in a simple and straightforward way, as well as a realistic and unbiased way, what would have happened if that situation never happened. So, now that I mentioned that, let's get started. So, when it comes to that particular topic, though, what would have happened if the transatlantic slave trade happened? It didn't happen, I should say. Just as this is just a what if scenario, okay? Of course, as you can already tell. So the first thing to mention out of the 2 points I'm going to mention is what would have happened to the civilizations themselves during the time they existed. Well, the first thing I can definitely say for that to answer the first point I'm going to get across for this video is the thing is they definitely would have developed a lot more. Because the truth about the transatlantic slave trade that a lot of people don't seem to understand, which is actually a lot of evidence to actually showcase that, especially with the amount of people who were kidnapped from Africa, is that there actually was civilizations in Africa. It's a well documented fact, okay? Were they as big as like the ones in like Europe and Asia? No. But a civilization, by its fundamental definition, just simply means a settlement where people are a settlement where people or I should say a big large settlement that consists of a lot of people who live there permanently, who don't move around like our ancestors, for all of us humans who are hunter gatherers. That's all a civilization is. Okay? And the truth of the matter is, when it comes to the idea that there are African civilizations, there definitely were. There are ones that maybe consisted of like 10, 20, 30, 50,000 people, and at the very most 100,000 people, which by the definition of civilization is still a civilization. So there were civilizations in sub-Saharan Africa for that matter, and there was numerous different ones for that matter. Actually, there was easily hundreds of different cities, that existed, and so on and so forth in Africa. Okay. There definitely were civilizations that existed in Africa for that matter. Okay. And the truth of the matter is, when it comes to the African cities and so on and so forth that actually existed, the truth of the matter is, when it comes to African cities and stuff that existed, okay, as you already know, as I was pointed out just now, you know, they didn't develop as much as they could have because of the transatlantic slave trade, because they're always warring with each other. And a lot of reason why they're warring with each other was because, of course, of the pressure the Europeans put on them to do it in order to make a profit for that matter. Okay. So when it comes to that, to those facts, those are things I want to put out there. Okay. And for this scenario, which as I said, I was getting into, what if they never did that? For that matter, okay? Which, as I'm certain you are aware, as anyone would be aware, the situation would be a lot different than it actually became. Because the truth of the matter is, if it never happened for that matter, um, you know, the first thing that obviously you need to come up with is a scenario. Well, how realistically could it have been like if it never did happen? And for that scenario, let's just say Africa did have slaves, which like literally every other culture in the world actually did have slaves. But let's just say they were refusing to sell it to Europeans for whatever reason, because maybe let's just say 100 years prior, there's some massive movement that took place in Africa that went against the idea of selling other Africans to people who are of course non-African, because they realize it's actually very problematic. It causes a lot of trouble and so on and so forth. Yada 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 yada. For that matter, okay. So if that were to have happened in the first place, um, if that were to have happened, for that matter, what would have happened to Africa as a result? Well, obviously, the thing is, if they created that rule, since especially when you look at the early days of when Europe was in Africa, they didn't even know what the hell they were doing, and especially the fact that it's a very tropical place, which the vast majority of literally them, let alone any other culture that was not familiar with the land, if not all, would have had extreme trouble being able to navigate there because there's a lot of diseases and stuff they were not used to. So the truth of the matter is, if there obviously were not those African um, civilizations and stuff, for I mean, or I should say, for that matter, if there was not those diseases and stuff, for that matter, if it was all diseases, I should say, and Europeans were not able to get in there because Africans were not letting them to come to that part of Africa, for that matter, because we already know there's a standard for slaves in the first place, then obviously as a result, no surprise, for that matter, Europeans would realize, to be honest with you, okay, we can't come here anymore because there's no purpose in coming here anymore because they're not going to let us in. Okay, so the truth of the matter is, they wouldn't have been able to do it, which as a result would have resulted in Africa developing a lot more. And as a result of African civilizations developing a lot more, there would have been a lot bigger cities and so on and so forth that developed over time, and they would have truly become a magnificent place in general, for that matter. Okay, because the truth of the matter is, the slave trade derailed Africa. It prevented Africa from developing. It prevented Africa from not just developing. It made people lose forget who a lot of who they are and stuff, and it just created a lot of unnecessary wars and all that type of stuff. But if it never happened, Africa would have developed absolutely more, at least for that matter. There definitely were cities that existed, so it would have developed more, which brings me to my second point. Would it have become developed like the rest of the world, for that matter? Now, this one, of course, I could imagine is going to be more controversial for obvious reasons, for that matter, to be quite honest with you. Um, when it comes to that particular issue, the simple answer to that question is yes. That would have become developed like other parts of the world when the Industrial Revolution at some point would have come around. It's just that the thing is, you know, that you also have to take into consideration, is that maybe it might not have been as big and as powerful as Europe or Asia, but it still would have been big in the first place, okay? That's the truth of the matter, okay? The truth is, Africa absolutely would have become developed, like a lot of other nations we have in the world, like China, Japan, and stuff. Because the truth is, Africa at some point probably could have been colonized, for that matter. Okay, because even though for the longest time they wouldn't have been able to colonize them, Europeans probably would have colonized them at some point, in some way, shape, or form. Okay, because that's what they did to literally everyone, for that matter. And when they colonized them, the Africans, just like people in India, would at some point have gotten their freedom. And once they got their freedom, guess what they do? They take knowledge and they develop, for that matter, okay? Because the truth of the matter, Africa can develop, like any other part of the world. It's just that it didn't develop for the longest time because Europeans, for that matter, didn't allow them to be able to develop in the first place. And even to this day, there's still quite a bit of evidence to kind of indicate that they are still trying to sabotage them, for that matter, to put it bluntly. Okay, so the truth of the matter is, in short, no. In short, no. Um, Africa would have not been poor. Okay, it would have developed. Okay, and it become developed like the rest of the world. So that's the truth of what would happen if the transatlantic slave trade never happened, for that matter, because Europe would have still had to rely on Africa anyway to make something that they could trade, rely on Africa in some way, shape, or form, for that matter, so they could trade something with them, for that matter. Because all technology, surprisingly, for that matter, most of the minerals needed for it come from Africa, which obviously, if they traded it with it, after Africa, in some way, shape, or form, got their independence, then they would realize, oh my gosh, we are um at, on the African side making a lot of money from this stuff, but we also need something in return, the technology that Europeans have. So that's exactly what have happened. It would have been an exchange of resources for ideas, and that's the truth of what I truly believe would have happened. Okay, and I'm not trying to be any BS or trying to act like, oh, Africa would have been this magical beacon of civilization, would have been more developed than China and India. I'm not that type of person. Okay, I'm not a Seren Sutton Seti type. Besides, Africa doesn't even care for that shit in the first place. Africans just want to live a good life and make sure that they're reputation is reputable throughout the world for that matter, okay? That's what they care about. They're not like Europeans particularly who always have to be about number one and all this type of shit. So that's the truth of the matter. So anyway, this is my video. I hope you found it interesting as well as informative. And just remember, if you like this video and videos like this, remember to thumb this video up and hit the subscribe button. And this is off to say. And simply put, I'm out. So bye.